All right, so we're going to move on to the part about philia, which is the second type of love. Um, and you can think of each of these types of love as being uh, a different sets of relations between functions. So the Eros set includes the relations between the first and the third of the same aspect. So, like first volition, a type with first volition interacting with a type with third volition. Um, but it also includes the interaction between the second and the fourth. So, for example, a type with second logic interacting with a type with fourth logic. And now we're going to move on to philia, which is interacting with the identical position. Um, Okie dokie. So, fundamentally different from Eros, which is based on attraction based on the principle of opposites, the system of love called philia is based on attraction based on the principle of similarity. Philia was partly discussed in the previous chapter. After all, what was previously called half Eros, which is the specificity relation, could with the same right bear the title of half philia, because in the combination, the crosshairs from the first to the third functions are accompanied by the identity of the second and fourth functions. Um, However, since in half Eros the crosshair plays a decisive role and identity plays an auxiliary role, softening internal contradictions, then by rights, philia should be considered such a combination of psychotypes where the identity of the function is complete. Yeah, and I don't want to get too nitty gritty here, but basically he has a kind of less systematic and much more limited view of type relations than something that you'll find in attitudinal psyche. But I think it's worth going over his ideas for a historical kind of grounding, understanding like the system's roots. But I think ultimately attitudinal psyche is superior and much more fleshed out, and again systematic. Okay. I very much suspect that Couperin's words quoted at the beginning of the Syntax of Love, "A good wife is like a worn out boot, you don't feel her," are connected precisely with philia, as well as the words of the ancient Roman about a beautiful new shoe invisibly squeezing the foot of its wearer, obvious eros. Unlike eros, philia love does not begin with words. It's him or her. I don't know what the point of that quote is, though. Um, Although mutual sympathy between people with the same order of functions arises immediately and irrevocably. Okay, so I think what he's saying is unlike Eros, philia love does not begin with the words, it's him or her, the person who's going to solve all my problems. Mutual sympathy between people with the same order of functions arises immediately and irrevocably. So there's a feeling of sympathy. Usually identical people of the same psychotype, first guess the kinship in each other based on the first two functions, and only later, as they become closer to each other, the complete identity of psychology, values, attitudes, etc. becomes clear. The moment when the identity of the order of functions is finally clarified usually becomes the starting point of the nascent novel. Um, the complete coincidence of principles, values, and attitudes becomes the starter of philia love and gives rise to hopes that are also not destined to come true. However, the illusions awakened by philia have their own logic, different from the logic of the illusions of eros. If with eros the individual seeing in excess of the extraneous first function, in vain dreams of filling the gap of his third function with this excess, then with philia the partners proceed from the idea that the simple addition of their equally defective personalities through a purely quantitative increment instead of a qualitative one is also able to alleviate their plight to effectively protect the vulnerable side of their nature. Right. Okay. So, yeah, I mean that's pretty self-explanatory. But instead of you know, the excess filling in the gap of weakness, it's instead, well, we'll just add together our strengths, and that will overcome our mutual weaknesses. Okay. However, as you know, multiplying one by one gives the result gives the result of one, no more. Therefore, even in the case of philia, illusions remain illusions. Of course, no one will sympathize with a spouse with third logic, as much if fool is said to him as a spouse with the same third logic. But to answer, you yourself are a fool. And she is not able to confidently prove this to the offender. In a word, philia not only does not contribute to internal growth, but also does not provide real protection. It's a pity the circumstance is usually discovered too late. At the same time, it would be wrong to think that philia is completely sterile and its passion is fed only by delusions. The identity of the processional functions, second and third, the position of the productive functions does not play a significant role here, brings something original and necessary to both parties to this system of love. Okay, so through the processional functions, identical type relations. So, an ELVF with another ELVF. Um, the processional functions are going to bring something original, um, whereas productive functions are, I guess, more insignificant. I'm not sure why, but I guess because of the processional, more like dialogical, interactive nature, um, something can be made, something can be invented in the relationship. Not sure. I'm just checking something on my phone real quick. Okay. The fact is that the identity of the processional functions at first creates the appearance of a stormy process, i.e., exactly what partners need most. Why not cause euphoria? Or I guess it's saying like a why not cause euphoria? However, in fact, it is not a process that takes place between spouses, but an exchange. The second function's exchange experience gained by the strengths of nature. The third function share weaknesses. And such an exchange, under all conditions, cannot be called useless. The partners bring everything they have obtained into one place, everything they want to share, multiply both contributions by each other, and divide the amount in half. As a result, both parties benefit. However, philia also has its negative sides. A person who is generally inclined to objectify his extremely subjective ideas, having found a kindred soul through philia, is even more confirmed in his imaginary rightness. Therefore, it is more difficult to convince a strong person with his 100% growth of the right to the existence of other different points of view than a lonely person. Exchange during philia has a particularly bad effect on the third functions because whatever one may say, they exchange not strength but weakness, and in this case, the wound in the third functions deepens rather than heals. Skeptics with the third logic become even greater skeptics. What they were, the hypocrites with the third physics are even greater hypocrites, etc. Moreover, the matter here cannot be due without mutual drama. The identity of the partners' complexes is convenient and painful. And there might have been more to that sentence, but it cuts off. Finally, the Achilles heel of any philia seems to be the fact that exchange with it is a rather short-term phenomenon. When the exchange is completed, people not feeling anything in each other that even remotely resembles otherness simply lose mutual interest. They look at each other as if in a mirror, knowing in advance all the advantages and disadvantages of the reflection, knowing that as soon as they make a movement, the reflection will exactly repeat it. A philia marriage is a copy of the relationship of Siamese twins, where the opposite parties are so connected and similar that they do not feel each other well, but do not injure each other. It may not be very interesting for people of the same age to be together, but it is convenient. Therefore, for individuals who are tired of life and expect only peace from marriage, I would advise them to look for a couple among the same people. A more peaceful marriage than with philia simply does not exist. Okay, so yeah, basically, you're very similar to the other person, and he's always talking about like love because I mean that's the point of the book, syntax of love. When we get into attitudinal psyche, it broadens the types of relationships to include, platonic relationships and non-intimate relationships. But, In any case, with Philia, especially identical types, it's just very peaceful, but not very stimulating because it's like it's very familiar and predictable, right? Um, and sorry if there's some like noise in the background. There's some like weird kind of ringing or buzzing coming from down the street that I can hear. So, um, although here too a reservation is required that long-term peace is ensured by Philia only when the second and fourth wills are identical. Relationships are more complicated when the first and third wills are identical. Okay. Oh, it's a siren. I think it's just a 12 o'clock siren. Okay. Never mind. A reservation is required that long-term peace is ensured by Philia only when the second and fourth wills are identical. Relationships are more complicated when the first and third wills are identical. Okay. So basically, 1V and 3V types have more complicated relations of Philia than 2V and 4V types. Okay. You don't have to be a prophet to predict disorder in the lives of the Philistine with another Philistine, meaning 2-3V types. Common sense itself dictates that the Philistine, a person who is initially at odds with himself, is least of all able to find peace together with his own kind. Of course, one can assume that there is something that redeems this kind of intimacy, if only due to the identity of psyches. However, one thing is clear. Touchy, suspicious, angry at themselves and at the world, the owners of the third will are less able, ready and eager than anyone else, without horror and hostility, to look in the mirror that Philia holds out to them. And again, this is in attitudinal psyche. It seems, at least so far, completely neutral about which types are in the relations. Like when you're talking about type relations, what matters is the type relation in and of itself, not the specific types. But for Afanasiev, it's actually the specific types that change the relationship. So a relationship between, an LVEF and another LVEF, it's identical relation, but it's going to have a different nature than between an LEVF and another LEVF because the position of wills actually changes the relationship to some extent. And that, it seems right, but it just adds a lot more complication to type of relations. But yeah, it's interesting, the notion. So the issue of power is especially painful when the third will types interact and are identical. The struggle for power in the families of the Philistines is reminiscent of a fight between bald people over a comb. The gigantic thirst to command is combined in the third will with a proportionate lack of self-confidence and irresponsibility. So the relationship takes the form of a chronic, petty, and non-binding front where none of the warring parties, despite the fierce struggle, is able to maybe admit, or where none of the warring parties, despite the fierce struggle, is able to deep down, it just says, is able to deep down, he doesn't want to win. So maybe deep down they don't care to win. I don't know. The relations of people with the identity of the third wills generally present a bitter, strange, and funny picture. It resembles a picture of an aquarium into which two male sticklebacks were released. These fish are remarkable in that, having taken one of the sides, they begin to check the enemy, as we say for lice, alternately driving each other into a corner. Mutual persecution among sticklebacks is a long process, but in the end, having determined their strength, they come to a consensus, establishing an invisible and not always equal border between themselves, which then neither side violates. It is very similar, only with reverse dynamics, that relationships develop when the three wills are identical, the third will is identical. The boundary of power functions between Philistines is established immediately. It is determined by the rating Both spouses scrupulously calculated long before the wedding. The rating of partners in the third will is influenced by a great many factors: gender, origin, age, appearance, education, wealth, profession, skills, and much more that is generally inaccessible to the eye of a person with a different order of functions. Okay. So the border between the Philistine Philia is established immediately. The history of further relations is a history of mutual attempts to violate this border. Usually, the man is the first to try to move the boundary of power functions in his favor. Having discovered to his pleasure and surprise that the resistance to him is very timid, a man to his own advantage usually tries to develop success, and not knowing that he does not win, but simply compresses the spring. Okay. It ends with the cornered wife breaking down, showing her teeth, and launching a counterattack. Since the aggressor himself is not distinguished by his fortitude, the counterattack is quite successful. However, sensing the weakness of her husband, the wife is tempted by the ambitious thought of not only returning what was taken away, but also profiting at someone else's expense. Therefore, following this thought, she drives him beyond a predetermined line and, on the shoulders of the enemy, bursts into his zone of power functions. Here, the husband, already driven into a corner, so as not to completely turn into a henpecked man and a doormat, gathers his courage, shows his teeth, and begins a successful counterattack, and so on endlessly. If we add to what has been said that time constantly makes adjustments to the rating of spouses, then the complexity, infinity, and futility of the struggle with the identity of the third will appear with utmost clarity. I would like to draw special attention to the fact that the identity of the third will complicates life not only along the husband wives line, but also along the father's children line. As already mentioned, children often exactly inherit the psychotypes of their parents, and the circumstance, in turn, I don't necessarily agree with that, in turn, can seriously influence the direction of Philistine battles. Unlike marital battles, the specificity of the struggle on the child father front during the third will is that the parent who is more often raped by his partner than the rapist um, is inclined to compensate for the weakness of his position at the expense of the child, taking it out on him and asserting himself, which the parent succeeds quite well, but for the time being. Um, yeah, that rapist part. Basically, it's. I think the translation is something more like, you know, pillaged or something, right? It's like he doesn't mean like literal rape. Um, but the problem is I don't know what it's trying to say exactly. Um, Unlike marital battles, the specificity of the struggle on the child father front during the third will is that the parent, who is more often raped by his partner than the rapist, is inclined to compensate for the weakness of his position at the expense of the child, taking it out on him and asserting himself. Yeah, not basically. I guess the father takes uh, takes out his like 3v angst on his children because his wife is 3ving him. Or I'm not sure. Or yeah, I'm not sure if his wife in this case is necessarily 3v or just the parent and child. Anyway, the parent succeeds in arbitrariness over the child for two reasons. Thanks to the child's crafty natural complacence and recognition by both parties of the reality of the family hierarchy. However, here I must warn, arbitrariness over the child with a third will always has a certain time limit. He allows pushing himself around only until a specific moment, until he comes of age or until he achieves economic independence. From this moment on, the recent little angel, the plasticine child, becomes an arrogant, uncontrollable, and constantly confrontational demon. In this case, the Philistine child experiences an explosion release of the previously suppressed will, and the force of the explosion is proportional to the imaginary and real grievances accumulated over the years of forced submission. Therefore, parents with a third will must, if they are not able to respect the child and recognize him as equal to themselves, be in any case ready. And it might cut off there. There are serious reasons to suspect that what was described above happened in the Dostoevsky family. Oh, man, I'm so yawny. Oh, man. All three, he, she, son, were Pushkin. So, an entire family of EFVLs. So, the history of relations in this triangle could confirm, refute, or supplement what was said above about the Philistine Philia. But this is precisely the specificity of the psyche of the third will, that it is secretive, and therefore, after the death of Dostoevsky, Anna Grigorievna, subjected to a total purge of everything, including indicating the cloudiness of relations in the family. And the son, according to the recollections of Postovsky, simply closed his mouth, and until the end of his days, he simply refused to talk about his parents. The situation is no better with the identity of third physicist. I know one couple of touchies, charming, sweet people who broke their marriage ties long ago. The center of the conflict in this case was, of course, sex. The usual dichotomy for third physics types, where greed is originally combined with timidity, forced as a participant in the drama, put it to behave in bed like your smelts in an aquarium. To behave in bed like your... I don't know what smelts are. Not sure. I also have a similar example of for the third emotion. Outwardly, a pair of beautiful, worthy, educated people, surprisingly suitable for each other, come together and spend a vacation together in nature. Everything is fine. 2 days later, without saying a word, he leaves. She is shocked. I didn't do or say anything that could push him away. I loved and love him. The answer is silence, although the answer could be formulated with certainty. The thirst for feelings was combined with the mutual impenetrability of crackers. Both not only did not receive the desired manifestation of feelings, but judging by the emotional tightness of their mouths, they did not even know how the person so close and so far away treated their partner. Okay. Difficulties in Philia also arise with the identity of the first wills. In order to at least partially imagine the specifics of the relationship between the kings, I will give an example. Not a marriage one, but a political one. Fate would have it at one time and at one point two first wills, two Socrates, Maximilian Robespierre and Joseph Foucher came together, and the history of their relationship in the context of Philia looks very instructive. So he's talking about two VLEFs. They said that while both were living in the provinces in Arras or Arras, Maximilian and Joseph were in awe. Robespierre even almost gave his sister in marriage to Fouché, maybe. You definitely believe such messages. In the provinces, power did not shine for both. The throne, signified for one, did not loom even in the most distant future, which means there was nothing to divide, there was no subject of rivalry. At the very first meeting, looking at each other as if in a mirror, Robespierre and Fouché discovered their psychological identity and, delighted by this circumstance, were no longer separated. They found in each other's company not only comfort and pleasantness, but also significant benefit, since in filial love, as we remember, among other things, there is an exchange of experiences gained separately, and at the end of such an exchange, the identity of a special order. Robespierre was the first to leave for Paris, and almost only the circumstance determined his leadership in the career marathon, which began for Fouché with some delay. Only chance, a head start in time, predetermined that Robespierre was the first to reach the pinnacle of power. since otherwise his chances, like those of an identical twin, would have been reduced by half. The same head start in time and mental identity made Robespierre the most powerful of Fouché's, I think it's Fouché's enemies, because the former knew too well what the latter wanted and what he was capable of. When the chair swayed under Robespierre, he immediately realized who the soul of the conspiracy was. He was the reflection in the water, the twin. 2 weeks before his death, Robespierre made a thunderous speech against Fouché, and repeats it the day before the coup. By the standards of that time, such speeches were tantamount to a death sentence. But to the bewilderment of contemporaries and historians, Robespierre hesitates, delays, and not for humanitarian reasons. By that time, he had already broken his hand so much that the execution of a man meant no more to the dictator than the execution of a cockroach. I guess broken his hand. Not sure what that metaphor means, but he was executing plenty of people. So there was only one creature in the world with whom no hand was raised, Fouché. A mystical weakness took possession of Maximilian when he thought about Joseph. He killed his friends without hesitation, but killing a twin was a special act that required superhuman effort, almost suicide. As luck would have it, on those same days, Fouché's little child, their child, dies. I'm not sure what that means, like their child. Strange. The dictator finally loses heart, the conspiracy matures, and Robespierre dies. At the same time, his death does not elevate Fouché to the pinnacle of power, but places him in the very important chair of the chief of the secret police. And formally, he remains in this capacity until the end of his career. But the relationships in the triangle are complicated. Napoleon, Fouché, Talleyrand, as in the diagram. Okay. Fouché is equal to Napoleon in strength of spirit, but smarter than the emperor. He is equal to Talleyrand in intelligence, but much more self-confident. Fouché's forces were dedicated to the struggle within this triangle until Napoleon's first abdication. Okay. With Napoleon's return to France, a new and most important period of life begins for Fouché. Power abandoned by the Bourbons and not yet raised by Napoleon finds itself in the hands of Fouché. Historians, it seems, do not even argue with the question of the master of France during the famous 100 Days is raised, especially during the period when, having left Paris, Napoleon headed towards Waterloo. Fouché reigned supreme in this country. What happens next is not interesting. Fouché achieved more than what his soul initially desired, more than simple supremacy in France, the object of desire of all French first wills. He restored the symmetry broken by Maximilian's once dizzying career. After the 100 Days, Joseph could again look into his brother's grave as if in a mirror. As in their youth in Arras, they were again Siamese twins. Both were Socrates types. Okay. Speaking about philia, we cannot ignore this type of relationship, which is best called pseudophilia. It may sound paradoxical, but there is a system of relationships that outwardly looks like philia, love based on the principle of identity, but it in fact is eros, love based on the principle of opposition. The essence of pseudophilia is the crosshairs from the first to the second and the third to the fourth, and the third function to the fourth. In the form of a diagram, pseudophilia can be depicted as follows. So basically, it's like we were just talking about VLEFs. So a VLEF and a LVFE have a pseudophilia relationship, which in attitudinal psyche is called a faux identity or false identity. So you just switch the first two letters and then you switch the last two letters, and you get the types that are false identicals or pseudophilia. The specifics of pseudophilia are easy to read even on a rough diagram. Two people meet and see the sameness of top and bottom, which at first approach is easily mistaken for identity, which naturally awakens mutual interest. People usually don't have enough time, conditions, and patience to clarify whether their similarities are absolutely true, and satisfied with this superficial approximate identity of pseudophilia, they rush to convince themselves that they have found what they are looking for, and they flare up. However, with the usual belated mutual recognition, the partners become more and more convinced of their mistake, and the roses of the imaginary Philia increasingly begin to bestow upon them the thorns of genuine eros. The difference is that, unlike ordinary eros, where feelings are heightened to love-hate, pseudophilia is characterized by a more toned-down form of feelings, and it just repeats love-hate again. So I'm guessing it was a different Russian word that maybe meant like maybe like dislike potentially. The complexity of feelings is due to the fact that although partners have the same functions as strong, the same functions are weak, identification is not possible due to the multidirectionality of the functions. It is not strength and weakness together with effectiveness and processivity that collide head on, but only effectiveness and processionality. Therefore, pseudophilia love always has a strange chimerical appearance. The values are the same, but there is no mutual understanding. So, in a state of incomprehensibility, and it freaking cuts off there, but we kind of get that there's a feeling of gradual like indifference and confusion and incomprehensibility. It's like you have similar interests, even similar like values and kind of like broad goals, maybe. But the way you're going about it is at cross purposes, um, and seems like counterintuitive or just seems like the wrong-headed way to go about things. Um, Typically, these relationships quickly enter a phase of chronic struggle, where the spouses, never tired of being surprised at themselves and each other, begin to thresh the strengths of their nature against the strengths of their partner, the weak against the weak, without realizing either the origins, the meaning, or the hopelessness of the struggle. Since the opponents are worthy of each other, the fight can drag on for decades, not only without any visible success, but even without serious mutual injuries. And while telling their own half, none of the participants in the struggle can show their sympathizers traces of any serious wounds. From what has been said, however, it does not follow that a duel with pseudophilia can cost nothing to opponents who have been standing against each other for years. It's terribly exhausting, but unlike Eros, when partners reach the finish line even more unhinged and disharmonious, the translation cuts off once again. Um, Man, I really wish I could find just a full English translation of this book. Um, Even if it's still kind of crappy translation, I wish if someone knows, please comment in the comment section. To more clearly present the mechanism of pseudophilia to the reader, I will give as an example the story of Boris Pasternak's first marriage. The relationship between Boris and Eugenia Pasternak can be schematically depicted as follows. Judging by the few descriptions of young Eugenia, by the way, that would be EVFL and I think VELF. Judging by the few descriptions of young Eugenia Pasternak, she really both externally and internally resembled Akhmatova. Here's one of her early portraits. What can I say about Xenia? A proud face with rather large, bold features, a thin nose with a peculiar cutout of the nostrils, a huge, open, intelligent forehead. Xenia is one of the most intelligent, subtle, and charming women I have ever met. Uh, if you remember that, according to Akhmatova, Pasternak somehow tried to hug her under the veil of a conversation about an inspiring poet, then you can guess. The attraction to women of this type did not leave him even after his divorce from Eugenia Pasternak. Pasternak's special affection for the Akhmatova type is evidenced, among other things, by his secret love for a long dead woman, which the poet carried throughout his life. Love for Larissa Reisner, the famous Bolshevik warrior. There is no doubt that Reisner was Akhmatova, meaning a VELF, but in this case, what is interesting is not this, but the fact that Pasternak, who buried many loved ones during his life, seemed to have mourned only the death of Larissa Reisner in 1926 in poems specially written for this occasion. Larissa, that's when I'll regret it, that I'm not death and zero in comparison with her. Um, okay, all right, anyway. 20 years passed, a lot of water has passed under the bridge, but when the time came for Pasternak to name the main character of his novel, he named her Laura. And about the one in whose honor he named her, Pasternak directly wrote to Varlam Shalamov, who was once also secretly in love with Reisner. I gave the name of the main character in memory of Larissa Mikhailovna, so a certain sequence can be traced in the attraction of Pasternak to Akhmatova. Yeah, a lot of these were basically the sections that I was gonna originally skip over, um, just because I remembered them reading them a year ago or whatever, and just being like, oh my god, get on with it. Uh, but I'm just gonna go through them because I already started it, so I'm just gonna finish it. When Boris Pasternak and Eugenia Lurie, um, first met, a current of mutual recognition ran through their similarly resonating order of functions. Both, high ranking well, are individuals, aristocrats filled with self esteem and self confidence. Both, in terms of high ranking emotions, are sensitive and artistic, which was confirmed by the areas of their activities. He is a poet, she is an artist. Both, according to low grade logic, are more prone to skepticism, and according to low grade physics, they are not of this world, impractical people who disdain contemptible benefits. Why not a couple? At first, a single scale of values really gave the relationship the tone and coloring of a honeymoon. However, time passed, and the previously hidden but genetically predetermined thorns of pseudophilia came to light. It turned out that her emotion and logic are processional, so she is a very sociable person. For him, they are effective, so he, on the contrary, is closed. Of all forms of communication, he prefers communication with himself, and if he enters into a conversation, his speech looks enthusiastic, stormy, in no way attached to the interlocutor, a waterfall monologue. Yeah, so that's something I've seen said about a best socian. I'm sorry, that's something I've seen said about Pente, which are the process, logic, and emotion types, um, and Dio, which are the process, or I'm sorry, the results oriented logic and emotion types. On like bestsocionics.com, they say that Pente is really talkative and sociable, whereas Dio isn't. Now, in my experience, I don't, I get where they're going with it, but it's not. I think the wrong. I think sociable and to imagine like Pente is more extroverted is very wrong-headed. That's not really what it is at all, actually. Um, because go and look at most FLEVs and compare them to like most EVFLs, and you'll see that probably the EVFLs are more classically extroverted. Um, it's just yeah, it's not really what it is. It's not. I would just push back against that. It's just that there's just going to be a lot more dialogue and questioning and exploration with Pentes with emotion and logic. Okay. Um, Whereas for Dios, there's going to be a lot more just like flippant expression or pronouncement in the case of logic. So it's not. Yeah, there's just this idea that like results orientations are more introverted and process ones are more extroverted. I don't agree with that. I think it's really the first and the third that are introverted, and the second and fourth, which are extroverted kind of. Really, it's like rather than introverted and extroverted, you just have these four orientations, and they all kind of have their own like nuances um, within that. But All right. In any case, I'm just commenting because I haven't really had much to say about these sections, but yeah, I don't know if it's true that DOs are really that introverted and unsociable and quiet. It seems oftentimes the opposite. Uh, but it's just once you see or kind of get process versus results attitudes, you can kind of pick up what they're saying here and what Alfanazi is saying here. All right. Anyway, the first will of Eugenia Pasternak, in turn, brought just as little color to the life of her husband. Not only was Eugenia inclined to chronically defend her independence in conditions when no one encroached on her, but she also made attempts uh, which rather surprised than frightened Pasternak to subjugate him to herself. The wife's jealousy, noticeable even from the outside, hurt and humiliated the poet, was only one of the manifestations of her ambitious endeavors. In one of his letters to his wife, Pasternak formulated part of his claims against her as follows: "You overestimate your age, your strengths, and your knowledge, and demand that I submit to you, who is domineering, hot tempered, jealously suspicious, and intolerant. At that time as this is the only obstacle to our happiness." The birth of a child especially strained the relationship between the spouses. It turned out that the asceticism of the fourth physics, Eugenia Pasternak, is much more sincere than the asceticism of the third physics of Pasternak himself. She really did not care about everyday life from the bottom of her heart, and the birth of a child, which added to her troubles, divided the feelings of the young mother. Pasternak himself was incredibly happy about his son as a confirmation of masculinity that was extremely important for his third physics. But the chronic lack of money and economic helplessness of the young father, of course, could not make life easier for the family. The situation was aggravated by the fact that the birth of a child required Eugenia Pasternak to take a break from her artistic pursuits, and this was tantamount to almost complete personal collapse, since according to her first will and second emotion, it was in her artistic career that she saw her true identity, interest, and opportunity for self-realization. In a word, the birth of a child led to the fact that the discord between the spouses spread across all functions, upper and lower. And here, for the first time, it was fully revealed what a terrible self deception that marriage turned out to be, how far they really were from each other. They who at first imagined themselves to be Siamese twins. Pasternak later wrote, "With faith in the future, I'm not afraid to seem like a talker to you. We are not life, not a spiritual union. We cut off mutual deception." Okay. These lines were written after the divorce, but they reflected the poet's long-standing feeling of the falsity of the pseudophilia that connected them. As for the immediate reasons that led to the break, they were, of course, based on the precession of will and physics of Pasternak, the order of the functions of the woman who took the place of Eugenia Pasternak, further confirmation of this. But how and why the poet's second marriage took shape will be discussed in the next chapter. So yeah, these these sections are pretty rough to read through, and I don't know how much really people will get out of them. Uh, but whatever, I'm gonna do as much as I can, and yeah. So moving on to Agape next.